really the nerve center of this book is a place called Jantar Mantar in Delhi, where all the resistance movements from all over the country gather, and they have their, of course now no longer are they allowed to stay there, but for many years people would stay there, they would live there for months, people on hunger strike, people protesting displacement, people, a whole host of things. And I had many friends among them, and I would spend nights there, and even quite often, when I was supposed to speak at a university, I would just say to the students, why don't you come here? And why don't you talk to the people here? And, they'll tell you more than I can ever tell you about what's happening.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Arundhati Roy. Even for booksellers who never have any shortage of books to read and authors to admire, there are certain books that we love or anticipate above others. Shortly after it was published in 1997, The God of Small Things won the Man Booker Prize and was named a New York Times notable book, and it has gone on to become a book beloved of readers worldwide. In the intervening years, Arundhati Roy has become a dedicated political activist and has written essays and book-length nonfiction on myriad issues of global importance, from defenses of marginalized peoples to critiques of contemporary imperialism. With news that her second novel was forthcoming in 2017, anticipation has run high, and I can tell you that it is worth the wait. How do you write fiction at a time when states are deformed by the violence they do in the name of nationalism and power? Roy's novel is this decade's ecstatic and necessary answer. We are thrilled to host Ms. Roy here this evening to read from and discuss this important new novel, so please join me in a warm welcome to Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Of course, back home where Hindu nationalism is on the rise, all they need is to see me speaking from the pulpit of a church. Don't tell them. It's really difficult to read parts of this book because they're also interconnected. But so even if you don't get all the connections, I'll try and explain them if you ask me when I'm down there. So I'm going to read from the latter half of the book. It's a chapter called The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin I. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jabin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that. Her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss. Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dimmed years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, cassiopeas, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from the agencies on both sides of the border. The valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters. And of course, misses. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse, nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shuhada, the martyr's graveyard where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is after all these years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin was not a member of the committee that decided what should be written on the signboard, but she was in no position to argue with its decision. Also, Miss Jabin hadn't notched up very many todays to trade in for tomorrows. But then the algebra of infinite justice was never so rude. In this way, without being consulted on the matter, she became one of the movement's youngest martyrs. She was buried right next to her mother, Begum Arifa Yeswi. Mother and daughter died by the same bullet. It entered Miss Jabin's head through her left temple and came to rest in her mother's heart. In the last photograph of her, the bullet wound looked like a cheerful summer rose arranged just above her left ear. A few petals had fallen on her coffin, the white shroud she was wrapped in before she was laid to rest. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shuhada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everyone understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands, like bird feed up in the mountains, or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance. Martyrdom stole into the Kashmir Valley from across the line of control, through moonlit mountain passes, manned by soldiers. Night after night, it walked on narrow, stony paths, wrapped like thread around blue cliffs of ice, across vast glaciers and high meadows of waist-deep snow. It trudged past young boys, shot down in snowdrifts, their bodies arranged in eerie, frozen tableaus, under the pitiless gaze of the pale moon in the cold night sky, and stars that hung so low you felt you could almost touch them. When it arrived in the valley, it stayed close to the ground and spread through the walnut groves, the saffron fields, the apple, almond, and cherry orchards like a creeping mist. It whispered words of war into the ears of doctors and engineers, students and laborers, tailors and carpenters, weavers and farmers, shepherds, cooks, and bards. They listened carefully and then put down their books and implements, their needles, their chisels, their staffs, their plows, their cleavers, and their spangled clown costumes. They stilled the looms on which they had woven the most beautiful carpets and the finest, softest shawls the world had ever seen, and ran gnarled, wandering fingers over the smooth barrels of Kalashnikovs that the strangers who visited them allowed them to touch. They followed the new Pied Pipers up into the high meadows and alpine glades where training camps had been set up. Only after they had been given guns of their own, after they had curled their fingers around the trigger and felt it give ever so slightly, after they had weighed the odds and decided it was a viable option, Only then did they allow the rage and shame of the subjugation they had endured for decades, for centuries, to course through their bodies and turn the blood in their veins into smoke. The mist swirled on an indiscriminate recruitment drive. It whispered into the ears of black marketeers, bigots, thugs, and confidence tricksters. They too listened intently before they reconfigured their plans. They ran their sly fingers over the cold metal bumps on their quota of grenades that was being distributed so generously like parcels of choice mutton at Eid. They grafted the language of God and freedom, Allah and Azadi, onto their murders and new scams. They made off with money, property, and women. Of course, women. Women, of course. In this way, the insurrection began. Death was everywhere. Death was everything. Career, desire, dream, poetry, love, youth itself. Dying became just another way of living. Graveyards sprang up in parks and meadows, by streams and rivers, in fields and forest glades. Tombstones grew out of the ground like young children's teeth. Every village, every locality had its own graveyard. The ones that didn't grew anxious about being seen as collaborators. In remote border areas near the line of control, the speed and regularity with which the bodies turned up and the conditions some of them were in wasn't easy to cope with. Some were delivered in sacks, some in small polythene bags, just pieces of flesh, some hair and teeth. Notes pinned to them by the quartermasters of death said 1 kilo, 2.7 kilos, 500 grams. Tourists flew out, journalists flew in, honeymooners flew out, soldiers flew in. Women flocked around police stations and army camps, holding up a forest of thumbed, dog-eared, passport-sized photographs grown soft with tears. Please, sir, have you seen my boy anywhere? Have you seen my husband? Has my brother by any chance passed through your hands? And the sirs swelled their chests and bristled their mustaches and played with their medals and narrowed their eyes to assess them, to see which one's despair would be worth converting into corrosive hope. I'll see what I can do. And what that hope would be worth to whom? A fee, a feast, a fuck, a truckload of walnuts. Prisons filled up, jobs evaporated. Guides, touts, pony owners and their ponies, bellboys, waiters, receptionists, toboggan pullers, trinket sellers, florists, and the boatmen on the lake grew poorer and hungrier. Only for the grave diggers there was no rest. It was just work, 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 with no extra pay for overtime or night shifts. Thank you. We've never had a conversation.
Yeah, never. Who did you say you were again? So everyone can hear us okay? Great. Lovely. I want to go back to the God of Small Things for one moment, because people have talked about how long you spent working on this book, which was a 10-year writing process. But let's go back to the 5.5-year process of writing the God of Small Things and what that was like, and then come to the process of the new novel.
Well, I'm a student of architecture and urban design. And after that, I worked for a while in cinema. I wrote screenplays, I designed films, I even acted in films. I'm embarrassed to admit. But and then I wanted somehow to work on something, to write something where, you know, money, commerce, contracts, negotiations did not come in before the work, you know. I just wanted to write something on my own without any negotiation. So I started to write The God of Small Things. And initially, I wasn't really sure of what I was doing. And then gradually, it's like willingly entering a prison. And you're just caught up in the story and these characters. And it took a long time. And I thought, you know, I mean, the films we made were lunatic fringe. So, you know, I thought writing a novel about, you know, if I was lucky, 200 people would read. And of course, it didn't turn out that way, but it was, I mean, both, to me, the idea that even if, you know, you've had two opportunities, which I have had two opportunities to write something where I have just taken my time, I have lavished everything I have, you know, written with your teeth and your toenails and your hair and your skin, and you've had the opportunity to do that twice. It's been a wonderful thing. Yeah. But both, of course, were very different in terms of how they got written and who I was when I wrote them. Yeah.
So what was the first moment that fiction returned for this story? You've referred to fiction coming to you. What was the first germ, what was the first moment, the first writing for the Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
Well, the first, I think the first, though it's not the beginning, I mean, I didn't, neither with The God of Small Things nor this, I don't sort of start at the beginning and end at the end. So the first idea or the first thing I wrote down in this book was really the nerve center of this book is a place called Jantar Mantar in Delhi, where you know, all the resistance movements from all over the country gather, and they have their, you know, of course now no longer are they allowed to stay there, but for many years people would stay there, they would live there for months. People on hunger strike, people protesting, displacement, people, a whole host of things. And I had many friends among them, and I would spend nights there, you know, and even quite often, you know, when I was supposed to speak at a university, I would just say to the students, why don't you come here? And why don't you talk to the people here? And, you know, they'll tell you more than I can ever tell you about what's happening in the country. So on one of those nights, suddenly, you know, there were so many, it's not the same as in the book, but to me, the idea came, and there were all these people there, and suddenly a little baby appeared, and nobody knew who had left her there or what to do with her, and all these very wise, ideological, wonderful movements suddenly didn't know what to do with this baby that appeared. And somehow that started the story for me. But you know, also, you know, I have, of course, been traveling to Kashmir a lot, and most of my very beloved friends and closest friends are from Kashmir. And when I go there, I realize that, as Fellini once said, you know, that fiction is truth. Because you cannot tell the story of a place like Kashmir simply by reportage, simply with evidentiary notes or human rights reports or the documentation of the dead or the atrocities or the calculation of missing people. You can't tell what it's like for a people to live under the boot of military rule for 25 years. What is it like to never know when your child will come back home? What is it like, even for soldiers who don't even know the place, to be in a system where they do have to commit atrocities, you know, or people who have been given impunity to do the most terrible things that finally turns their minds What is it like for a population in India who are not protected from this, but who are supposed to stand up and applaud every time news of something horrible comes? You know, I mean, even here, you know, when the American army or invasion happens, you're supposed to cheer when a country is destroyed, right? So similarly, what does it do to us to hold the moral responsibility for atrocity within us? How do we then, you know, cry out about injustices that are done to us? What is it like for soldiers who come from Dalit castes to be part of an army that is shooting down innocent civilians in Kashmir? What does it mean for Kashmiris to be sent to Chhattisgarh or Assam? You know, just like the old colonials, the Indian government sends Kashmiris to Assam, Assamese to Tamil Nadu to Nagaland, and you know, it works like that. So fiction became really a way of trying to describe the air, you know, from various points of view, not simple, not a political statement, but how do you create a universe? Because it's not an argument. Fiction is not an argument. It's a worldview. It's a universe.
It seems to me one of the things you're also doing, though, is you're challenging a kind of constricting of the imagination that is political, a kind of way of thinking only in terms of economics, only in terms of neoliberalism, only in terms of one's own narrow identity, and that by showing all these different perspectives, you're opening up a different kind of imagination.
Well, you know, that's the other thing that I feel quite strongly about, you know, that there's a sense in which there's a sense in which our imaginations are getting domesticated. And fiction is getting domesticated too, that it has to be a theme. We have to be able to describe our books in 3 sentences, and, you know, can you just, or, you know, it's to me, I think of it, it's like our imaginations are like now sort of NGO funding proposals, you know? You sort of, are you working on gender? Are you working on caste? Are you working on peace in Kashmir? Or, what, you know, or are you working on patriarchy? And actually, fiction has the power to connect these things, to again tell you this is the air we breathe, because I mean, I don't want to get into it. It's so hot.
Yeah. It's all right. We can all take a moment.
So, yeah, by separating these things and by looking at them only separately, we lose a political vision that actually then gives us an idea of what solidarity means, you know, or who our comrades should be, or how we are being divided. I mean, India, of course, is a society that has forever made institutionalized social hierarchy. The caste system, of course, every society is unjust. Every society has its hierarchies. But here it's institutionalized. You have 4,000 different castes or more with strict rules of who can marry who, how it should be, what are the divisions within those castes. And it's a society surprisingly obediently living inside that grid, a wire mesh more than a grid, not challenging it. And so how do you look at all this with the eyes of a fiction writer, which is not sort of intimidated into functioning within those grids, you know, which is what they want, you know. So you, would I? Thank you. So, yeah. So that's why the structure of the novel, the structure of this novel was a risk, because I wanted to look at storytelling, not because the novel is largely set in a city, but I wanted to look at the art of storytelling like a city planner, you know, like a city which has a form, but that form isn't always controlled, that the planning is ambushed by immigrants, by unauthorized structures, by blind alleys, by lanes you walk down, by characters who suddenly appear, and yet it has a form, but not one that you can just, you know, swallow like a vitamin pill, you know?
Right. I think it's also fascinating that you told a story in The God of Small Things. It was set in a particular region of India, Kerala. This book is set largely in Old Delhi, also in Kashmir, as you say. And there's ways in which someone could see this as somehow a local story or stories specific to those contexts. And yet, God of Small Things is translated into more than 40 languages. This new novel is already in more than 30 languages. And there's something about this story that crosses also national boundaries and geographical boundaries. I wonder if you could talk about what it is about fiction that allows certain stories, certain narratives to cross those national boundaries that are being, well, we're in an era where in fact those borders are being more strictly enforced and walls are being constructed, and language is often seen as a barrier to those kinds of connections being made, and yet your stories have actually found a way of crossing those boundaries.
I mean, to be honest, I really don't know what the answer to that is, you know, because I don't think we ever know, like, why does something, you know, why does that happen? Because I have never, you know, I have never sort of left India. I haven't studied outside. I haven't, even these last 20 years, you know, my writing was always, the nonfiction was always an intervention in a situation that was unfolding all the time and urgently intervening in those places. And yet, obviously what happens in some way is that the more particular you are, perhaps the more it translates, you know, because people understand it as relating to themselves when you're not trying to kind of generalize. I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to that. But I think, you know, just when you mentioned the idea of borders and boundaries, when I didn't have any theoretical construct when I started writing this book, but now I see that almost every character in the book, almost every character in this book has a kind of incendiary border running through them. And maybe it is a reaction to this grid in which we are pressed down in India and how we have to function in that grid, you know. So the book opens with a woman called Anjum who's born a hermaphrodite, and then she lives in the Khwabga, which is an Urdu word for the house of dreams in Old Delhi, in a community, with a community of people who call themselves Hijras, but they are all not the same gender, you know, and they do have a tradition which sort of predates this new Western liberal discourse on gender. But inside the Khwabga, they are different. You know, there's Anjum, there are people, there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Christians, there are Shia, there are Sunni, they all have a little world of their own, but they refer to the outside world as the dunya, which is the world. And their own world, they think of as separate. But then Anjum actually even leaves the Khwabga later. Her story is interesting because she gets caught up in the 2002 massacre of Muslims that took place in Gujarat. So you see, she's caught up in the massacre, not because she's a Hijra, but because she's a Muslim. And in fact, she survives it because she's a Hijra, and the murderers think it's bad luck to kill a Hijra. So she thinks of herself as butcher's luck. And anyway, for whatever reason, she leaves the Khwabga and starts living in a cemetery. There on the borders between the living and the dead, who in the cemetery, and ultimately she builds a guest house there called the Jannat Guest House, which is called the Paradise Guest House. And one of her partners her business partner is a young man who was a Dalit who also watched a right-wing cow protectionist mob murder his father. This is happening, in his case it happened in 2002, but it's happening every day in India now, almost all the time. You're reading news about these lynchings that are taking place. And he, in a rage and anger, converts to Islam. And he calls himself Saddam Hussein because he is very impressed by this video of Saddam Hussein at his own execution and the disdain he shows for his executioners. So Saddam, now he has a border running through him, incendiary in modern India today, of caste and religious conversion. Another character called Tilotama, whose father is a Dalit, so she has the border of caste. You have Musa Yesvi, who lives in Kashmir, a national border running through him. And so somehow these characters, pushed to the edges of society by the big wheels that turn, find each other in the place of falling people. And they create an alliance, not a political alliance, but an alliance of utmost happiness, a fragile alliance, but by expanding in the face of attack and not contracting. So I think borders play an important part. There are borders between humans and animals too that are porous. The ministry is almost as much about animals as it is about human beings.
The birds in particular play an interesting role. Could you talk for a little bit about the birds and the characters and the kind of perspective they bring to the story?
Oh, well, the book opens with an account of, when I was, many years ago, I live in Delhi, and for years and years, you look up into a tree and you would see the silhouette of the white-backed vulture looming in the trees. It was something that really was Delhi for me. It was heartwarming. And vultures are birds, who've lived on this earth for millions of years, and suddenly they are extinct in Delhi now because they died, because the cattle are given this kind of cow aspirin. It's called diclofenac, and it's just lethal for white-backed vultures. And the cattle are given the aspirin to become better dairy machines, So the vultures have all died and gone away, and in the graveyard, the book begins with Anjum living in the graveyard like a tree, and she can feel the grip of the talons of the ghosts of these vultures, like an ache in an amputated limb. And so there are, even in a big city like Delhi, one of the things that I love about living in India is that there are feral people, there are feral animals, there are feral imaginations, which have not yet been domesticated. So even in the cities, there are dogs and peacocks and, creatures, cows and bulls, and you can't clean up a space. Everything just invades it at some point. And so all the borders in the book are porous. However hard you try to police them, whether it's the line of control between India or Pakistan, or trying to clear the city of creatures or sanitize it for the middle class. It just doesn't work. Eventually, the borders are breached.
I want to ask one more question before we open it to the audience, but we should invite people certainly to come stand in line if you do have a question. Can you talk about the dedication of the book?
The dedication. The book is dedicated to the unconsoled. And I think sometimes we are probably perhaps the ones who display brittle happiness are the most unconsoled. But I'm sure that all of us, somewhere deep inside ourselves, are unconsoled. Yeah.
Okay, so what I would just say is what often happens at these conversations is a lot of men line up and not a lot of women, even though as I look out on this audience, I see a lot of women. So I'm going to abuse my authority as the narrator here to ask the women who are in the line to come to the front. Yeah. After 3 centuries of being at the end of the line, you can be at the front of the line. Okay, great, thank you, please.
Hi, my name is Iram Usmani. I've been an ardent fan for a long time. I'm sure you've heard that before. I hold you in utter respect.
Thank you.
I want you to know at what point in your life you became aware of what you wanted to do. I know you said you did movies and stuff, but how you dissect, the culture, ethnicity, religion, and you kind of put everything aside and you are who you are. And I mean, was it an external influence? Was it nature, nurture? What was it? That's my question.
Well, I suppose in a way, it was the fact that I grew up in a little village in Kerala. My mother belongs to a community called the Syrian Christians, who are only a very tiny community in Kerala, though a very entitled community. But she broke the rules and married outside and married a man from Bengal who was a Hindu, was divorced and returned to the village completely shunned in a way. I mean, me and my brother were just constantly told that, I certainly was constantly told that no one will marry you, and as though I was longing to marry them. But anyway, but I so I suppose although I cannot claim any form of social oppression or economic oppression, although my mother was very, very badly off, but complete exclusion, surely. And so I think that began a process of questioning. But also when I was, my parents separated when I was I think I was 1 or something. So I'd never seen my father. I didn't know what it was like. But there was a Australian missionary who somehow got hold of me when I was, 5 or something. She used to teach me, and every day she used to tell me, I can see Satan in your eyes. So I think the first coherent piece of writing I ever did was, I wrote, I still have that notebook, I hate Miss Mitten, and I think her knickers are torn. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Shruti. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for you to break my heart twice with your second book. I was just wondering, I always ask people I admire for book recommendations. I was just wondering what some of your favorite books are, or if you're reading anything right now that you're really enjoying or that's moved you.
Well, I think it'll be a very ununique answer, but right now, I was reading, should I really say it? War and Peace.
It's okay, you can brag.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know why. For some reason, I've been inside Russian novels and Russian poetry. So Anna Akhmatova, Mandelstam. A book that I found remarkable was Hope Against Hope by Mandelstam's widow, Nadezhda Mandelstam. It's an amazing book. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Erej Safraz. I'm originally from Pakistan, Lahore, the Delhi sister city. I wanted to ask you, right now I'm on chapter 3 of your new book. I really like it. I wanted to ask you how you see the acceptance of homosexuality evolving in India. Coming from Pakistan, I know that's a topic that's still in a very early stages compared to the West. So I wanted to see if you see any positive improvements in India.
Well, the Supreme Court of India recently criminalized it. You know, the High Court had a judgment that decriminalized it, and then the Supreme Court recriminalized it. And you know, obviously we have a government that does not look upon it with any generosity. But at the same time, there's a lot of debate, and it's not like, you know, what is happening in Bangladesh yet. But criminalizing it is a very retrogressive step. So, but you know, as with the case of the Hijra community, with homosexuality, with queerness, you know, there is a tradition in our societies which predates the legal discourse, where there is a kind of acceptance. So it's not, you know, I don't think that there's a great sort of, it's like there are these loose plates, you know, and so in some areas there's a great, it isn't frowned upon. I mean, if you read the memoirs of Babur, he will talk about it. Emperor Babur, I'm talking about, you know. And then now in this legal rights-based way, there's retrogressive stuff going on in the courts. But yeah, so it's complicated for me to answer in any clear way.
Thank you very much.
My name is Jayan Kamishar. I'm from Kumaragam.
Okay. That means very close to where I grew up.
Question for posterity. If there were two options that you would like people to remember you by, what would you prefer out of two? A brilliant writer from Aymanam or a noble Robin Hood from Delhi?
Look at these choices.
You can pick only one.
No. Look, I mean, you're presuming that I want to be remembered. I'm not sure. No, come on. Like, we don't, this is exactly what this book quarrels with, these single identities, you know. But thank you.
Ms. Roy, I'm Sher Azam from Balochistan in Pakistan. History is strewn with persecution of minorities, may they be religious, may they be racial or ethnicity and genders. From women in many parts of the world to communities like the Kurds in the Middle East, Kashmiris, and the Baloch. What can we do as members of the international community to do more of what you're doing, fighting against this oppression? That's my question.
See, I think one of the important things is what you said, to always remember that these battles, whatever they may seem to be, like in India, it's a majoritarian Hindu nationalism versus the minorities of Muslims, Dalits, Christians, Sikhs. In Pakistan, it's the opposite. You know, so it's always not about Islam or about Hinduism or about any particular religion as much as it is about the impulse to majoritarianism. And, you know, it is so I think the important thing is to remember that, you know, and to always move against that impulse. It's not it's not an essentialization of any particular religion or any particular ethnicity, but this impulse,
Okay, I'm sorry. After this question, we definitely have to bring some more women to the front. This is has become a string of men, as I predicted, followed by a string of women. I'm sorry, not to be binary in our thinking here, but let's. And then we actually don't have much time, so let's also try to get through a couple more questions quickly, because Arundhati is going to read from her new novel again, if we're lucky.
5
we
minutes.
allow time.
Related to the last question, in the spirit of internationalism, I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about the UAPA in India, and in particular the arrest and imprisonment of so many, including Dr. Sai Baba, who was recently given a life sentence, quite unjustly.
Thank you for asking that. He's a friend of mine, actually. He's talking about a professor called Sai Baba, who is actually a good friend of mine, who is 90% disabled in a wheelchair and has been sentenced to life imprisonment for being a Maoist. And his real crime was, along with me being one of the people who campaigned against what was known then as Operation Green Hunt, where the government had created vigilante groups as well as moved paramilitary forces, tens of thousands, into the forests of central India, where they had signed memorandums of understanding, moving indigenous people out of the land to give it over to mining companies. And so there was absolute violence inside those villages. You had thousands of paramilitary surrounding villages and deep inside the forest, setting them on fire, raping people, killing people, displacing people. And and there's a law. I mean, there are law. Of course, it's the same in the U.S., but we call ourselves a democratic country, but we have a law like the law he mentions, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which makes even thinking an anti-government thought a criminal offense. So you have thousands of people, the poorest people, in jail in central India. People who are protesting displacement are being called anti-national. They are arrested under this law or under a law of sedition, thrown into jail. I, in fact, am also under trial right now, criminal trial, for having written a piece about Professor Sai Baba called Professor POW, where I just said that he should be given bail because his wheelchair was broken. He was having to crawl around his prison cell on all fours. And they, of course, gave him bail but reconvicted him and charged me with contempt of court. But yes, so in this flourishing democracy, there are vast parts which are literally under army and police rule. In Kashmir, the army is turned into a bloated administrative force. In Chhattisgarh, in central India, the police are turning into the army. Either way, people are living under a kind of military rule.
Okay, so I think this will be the last question, and then we'll give Arundhati some time to read.
My name is Isabel. I'm a poet, and I find a lot of poetry in your writing. It's gorgeous writing. When I was in 10th grade and I read your book, The God of Small Things, I was blown away, and I had never really encountered writing like yours before. And I wanted to ask you about your writing style and about the certain things you do, especially in that book, capitalizing select words, paying incredible close attention to certain details of things. Did you have influences in your life that caused you to make those choices, or was that just a style of writing that felt right to you? How did you come across those choices?
I think, of course, there were influences, and the two or three that I can tell you for sure. I mean, we don't always know what influences us because sometimes it's subconscious, but Kipling was a great influence, even though he's a great imperialist and racist, but still, he was a beautiful writer. Shakespeare was an influence. And also this form of dance in Kerala called Kathakali, which is written, I write about in The God of Small Things, of course, but it's a form of storytelling where the body of the dancer is the narrator, and he, you know, to me what I admire about it as a mode of storytelling is how nothing too epic is too epic, nothing, and you can move from that to ridiculousness, to humor. You can become everything. You can become the river, you can be the deer, you can be the woman looking in the mirror, you can be the monkey flying across with the mountain in your hand. You know, and the suppleness of that kind of storytelling has always impressed me greatly. But also, I think one thing I learned about myself is that I hear my writing. When I write to an audio track. Like I can hear, I learned it because I read the audio book of this. And I realized that I already had read it aloud in my head, you know, like the rhythms and the sounds and the alliteration and everything. So yeah, I think I hear it.
Well, with that very good question, that's an excellent transition to finding another passage you could share with us.
Shall I go back to the pulpit?
It's so beautiful, why not? Then we'll get more photos of the church you were never in.
Oh, perfect. The chapter, it's just a 5-minute reading, and the chapter, appropriately enough, is called the Nativity. It was peacetime, or so they said. All morning, a hot wind had whipped through the city streets, driving sheets of grit, soda bottle caps, and beady stubs before it, smacking them into car windscreens and cyclists' eyes. When the wind died, the sun, already high in the sky, burned through the haze, and once again the heat rose and shimmered on the streets like a belly dancer. People waited for the thunder shower that always follows a dust storm, but it never came. Fire raged through a swathe of huts huddled together on the river bank, gutting more than 2,000 in an instant. Still the amaltas bloomed, a brilliant, defiant yellow. Each blazing summer it reached up and whispered to the hot brown sky, "Fuck you." Sorry, church. She appeared quite suddenly a little after midnight. No angels sang, no wise men brought gifts, but 1,000,000 stars rose in the east to herald her arrival. One moment she wasn't there, and the next, there she was on the concrete pavement in a crib of litter, silver cigarette foil, a few plastic bags, and empty packets of Uncle Chips. She lay in a pool of light under a column of swarming, neon-lit mosquitoes, naked. Her skin was blue-black, sleek as a baby seal's. She was wide awake but perfectly quiet, unusual for someone so tiny. Perhaps in those first short months of her life, she had already learned that tears, her tears at least, were futile. A thin white horse tethered to the railing, a small dog with mange, a concrete-colored garden lizard, 2 palm-striped squirrels who should have been asleep, and from her hidden perch, a she-spider with a swollen egg sac watched over her. Other than that, she seemed to be utterly alone. All around her, the city sprawled for miles, 1,000-year-old sorceress, dozing but not asleep, even at this hour. Gray flyovers snaked out of her Medusa skull, tangling and untangling under the yellow sodium haze. Sleeping bodies of homeless people lined their high, narrow pavements, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, looping into the distance. Old secrets were folded into the furrows of her loose parchment skin. Each wrinkle was a street, each street a carnival, each arthritic joint a crumbling amphitheater where stories of love and madness, stupidity, delight, and unspeakable cruelty had been played out for centuries. But this was to be the dawn of her resurrection. Her new masters wanted to hide her knobby varicose veins under imported fishnet stockings, cram her withered tits into saucy padded bras, and jam her aching feet into pointed, high-heeled shoes. They wanted her to swing her stiff old hips and reroute the edges of her grimace upwards into a frozen, empty smile. It was the summer grandma became a whore. Thank you. Thank you.
Even more than immortality, science is really about transforming humans into gods. And I mean this in the most literal sense possible. You think about the abilities and the qualities of gods in ancient mythology and in ancient religion. And one after the other, these are our goals.